Welcome to the Audrey Hall Show. Today, Framingham Police Chief Lester Baker and Framingham Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Robert Tremblay, will be talking about the recent active shooter alert that was triggered at Framingham High School and other timely police and school department issues. Chief Lester Baker began his police career in 1996 in Lexington, Massachusetts, and he's been on the Framingham force since 2003, appointed chief in 2020. Welcome, Chief Baker. It's always great to have you here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
20 years on the force, and then you became chief, and you've been chief for almost 3 years, correct?
Correct.
So what would you today tell your younger self at the beginning of your police career that you know now that you didn't know then?
That's a great question. I would definitely tell myself, make sure you continue to grow and don't stay stagnant, to think ahead. Don't become complacent, because this job's always changing, as you see. I would just tell myself, it took me a lot longer in my career to get to that point to realize just because you did it that way in the past doesn't mean you have to do it that way in the future. And I would try to stay ahead of things. I'm very cognizant of that now, but I would have started that a lot earlier in my career if I could tell myself what I know now.
And you have many years ahead of you, so knowing that now, I'm sure, changes the way you approach everything.
Yeah, I know it now, and I tell the newest officers that as well. That's part of the regular thing I say to them is make sure you stay ahead of your profession. Don't stay stagnant, because your profession will pass you by if you don't keep up on it, and try to grow yourself and keep growing.
I think it's great advice. I hope people take it and understand that you speak from tremendous experience.
I do as well.
Let's touch first on what happened recently in February at Framingham High School when there was an active shooter alarm that went off. It was about 10:15 in the morning on a Friday. It was the Friday right before schools were going to be getting out for the winter break, and this alarm went off, and it triggered fear and a response that is supposed to help protect people in the case of an active shooter. The reports that I've seen and read talked about Framingham police cars zipping and speeding all the way across town, trying to get there as quick as possible with almost every patrol car there. What was the command? What was the procedure, the process for responding to that? How did you find out about it? And then let's talk a little bit about, God forbid anything happened in the future that was real, because luckily that was not, that was a false alarm. You know, what measures would be taken differently going forward? So
for us, the call came in. We were actually, the command staff was actually in a meeting, a statewide meeting, discussing the swatting calls, the false erroneous calls about such incidents. However, when I received this report, I was told that there were officers actually in the school, that this alarm was triggered, so we did not deem it as a hoax. This was real to the officers, and like you said, I was sitting upstairs and I could hear car after car after car after car leaving the station, and I was told that there was a report of an active shooter at the high school.
Where did the call? Where did the call come to you from?
Inside my command staff, from my deputy chief of operations. He received notice from the watch commander that this was happening, almost live time, pretty much.
And so the call came in, and all these cars started taking off.
Yeah, obviously all the cars on the street immediately responded. Anybody inside the station responded. Some of the people in my meeting jumped up. They responded. I went to respond myself and was told that's no longer my role. But that was my first response, was to get up there and do all you can. And as you said, that was a very tragic event for those kids. Obviously, they were completely scared from the videos I saw and all the footage and what I heard. These kids were scared, and it's gonna probably haunt some of them for a very long time. But I have to say, I commend every last one of those students, because they did what they were supposed to do. Why would you want to stay inside and be a target?
Oh, absolutely.
They heard that there was a possible shooter in one of the halls, and those that could escape did just that. So I commend those students for their bravery and not becoming victims, because again, nobody thought this was a hoax. When you're in school, in class, and you hear an alarm going off that there's a shooter. And I even heard that some of these students went back looking in the classrooms trying to help other people out. So it's very upsetting for them, but we need to commend these kids for the way they conducted themselves.
It's the world unfortunately, it is the world we're living in right
Yeah.
now. We have had so many school shootings across the country, and they just keep happening, unfortunately. And so you have to take them seriously. But like you said, the trauma and just the life experience that comes from this, the fear and the thought that you might actually lose your life or see other people you care about lose their life in such a situation like this is something you just don't get over very quickly.
Absolutely not. And those kids, you know, some of them kids are definitely going to need some counseling or anything else. And the officers as well. A lot of people don't realize that we demand that if you're the first officer at a call of an active shooter, you don't wait for backup. You, whether it's me or the most junior patrol officer, you're going to go into that building. And that's what those officers did. There were 2 officers that were inside the school that immediately moved to where they thought the active shooter was. And all the officers that responded, as the kids were running out, they were running in. And that's what we demand of our police department. I would accept nothing less. We've heard about the tragic incident down in Texas. I would not stand for that. That's not how we trained.
They were hours outside without moving in.
Yes, I will not have that in my police department. And I'm very proud of those officers, and they did what they were trained to do. Obviously, it was a false alarm, thank God, but until they knew that, they immediately, one after the other, immediately showed up and entered that building.
So Chief, you said there were 2 officers there. Were those the school resource officers or officers who arrived at the scene?
No, those were actually 2 detectives that were there doing a follow-up on something unrelated. Just happened to be there.
So they went right into...
Right, which also ramped up the officers because these detectives now are calling saying, hey, this is happening over there.
They heard the alarm.
Over their radios. They heard the alarms and moved to the alarms and then notified the other officers. So this wasn't a matter of, hey, here's one of those calls again. These officers are now actively, within seconds, moving towards that alarm.
How did you find out it wasn't real?
So when officers started arriving, we were being told that this is possibly a false alarm, but they're still investigating. So obviously we, kind of waiting, and then we were told that this is probably a technical issue, that this is false, and it was starting to ramp down, and that's how I was notified.
Mm-hmm. So what is your protocol for this type of event? Is there a standard protocol? Is there a process? Because I had looked and found that Homeland Security has actually published a guideline for active shooter responses. It was back in 2015, which seems probably outdated to me by now with all that's transpired since then. But is there a particular process or guidelines from any resource that you follow?
So for us, we don't. It started out with Columbine, and you were told you would surround the building and you would wait for a SWAT team, and then the SWAT team would enter. Then, these mass shootings continue. Then you were told to wait for 4 officers to arrive, and then 4 officers enter the building. Now, what we do if there's an active shooter, we enter the building. Whether you're the first officer or the 5th officer or the 25th officer, we're going to enter that building and we're going to stop the threat. And that's the way we train. And we're very blunt about it. I'm very blunt about it with the new recruits. Our training officers are very blunt about it with our officers. And I'll tell officers, if this isn't for you, you got to make that decision now, because you can't hesitate. You can't wait when someone's life's on the line.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked about some of the trauma for the officers, and what do you do internally to help with that?
Yeah, so that's often overlooked. The first thing we did is we brought every single officer, and it was pretty much the entire shift that was on the road, all the officers that were in the station, and you have to have a debrief. They went into that building thinking this is real, and they went forward. And at some point, your body, once all that adrenaline dumps over, you could be a little bit shocked, you could be a little bit unsettled. Some people just had to take a moment and pause. Some people had to call their kids, but that's very traumatic for them as well. So there's follow-up. We'll do more debrief sessions. We can't just let that go there. And I can honestly say that when I got on this job in 1996, we would go through something horrific, anything, and then you just went to business as normal. Like I talked about at the beginning of the show, you got to learn to adapt and grow. We've had officers in horrific situations where you keep them on the road and they go to the next call. We no longer do that. You got to pull somebody off the road. You got to take care of those that take care of you, is the line that I like to use. And I got to now follow those officers' well-being as well, and make sure I keep reaching out to them to make sure that they're doing okay with this.
You've got to take care of those that take care of you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You said, you were quoted as saying that you didn't know that the new active shooter alarm system was live yet.
Correct.
How does that happen, that we have a system in a high school like that and no one's really aware of it, whether it be the superintendent, the administration, the police department?
So my understanding now is that the alarm should not have been live. Even though it went off, it was supposed to be stagnant. However, that was not the case. So it wasn't that they didn't notify us that it was live. It was supposed to be stagnant, but it obviously wasn't.
But it had been there for a while, right?
It had been there for a while.
So why was it supposed to be stagnant if it had been there for a
Because
while?
there was still going to be some testing for it before it was going to be implemented. And I believe the testing was going to take place the week of school vacation. However, there was some maintenance being done on the alarm during the school day, and we all know what happened after that.
Right. So is it active now?
I do not believe so, no.
How long is that going to take?
I'm sure Dr. Tremblay can answer those questions for
we'll
you.
make sure, because he's going to be with us
Yeah.
later, and we'll make sure to talk about that and find out when that might happen. And I'm sure there'll be some checking and processes in place. Let's talk about the fact that every police car went to the high school for this alarm. Is that safe for the rest of the city when something like that happens, for all of the police cars to go to one location?
Yes, it wouldn't have to just necessarily be an active shooter call.
Right.
You could have, there's times when you could have multiple crime scenes. I can think of an incident where we had a shooting scene, suspect would stop at another location, and then you have a victim at a hospital. You now have 3 crime scenes. You could have several cars tied up. There's always a contingency plan in place. We do mutual aid for other communities do mutual aid for us. So you would never go without, if you call 911, someone's gonna come.
Okay.
So even though we're responding officers outside the area to an area, we wouldn't, if you did call, we're not gonna tell you to call back.
Right. Okay. And is there any takeaway from this particular situation and this experience that will apply next time to change things?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for the school department, but I think obviously not testing anything or any maintenance on an alarm as well. And yes, we wanted to pull all that footage. We went over all the radio transmissions, and more importantly, speaking with the officers in a group, one-on-one. And we do this after any main event, after the marathon, any type of briefing, even after certain calls. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What can we do better? And obviously this is a big one, and we'll take this incident and we'll train from it and learn from it.
Is there anything that can be done preventatively? We live in a world now where this is all too common. Any other measures that you think can be taken to try to prevent things like this? It almost seems like a crazy question, because if it were the case, we wouldn't be experiencing this all over the country. But
I think, and I'm going to be very blunt when I say this, we can't find fault and make excuses for people that do bad things. There are people that do bad things and they need to be held accountable. So if you're willing to do something this horrific, you need to be held accountable, and you're responsible for the actions that took place. What we need to do as far as preparing, like I talked about those kids, you got to have blunt conversations with your kids. The police department will do it, the school will do it, but the parents need to have these blunt conversations with children and let them know what is happening in the world today. And it's a very tough conversation to have, but you got to tell your kids this situation may happen and what to do. So God forbid it ever does happen, this isn't the first time they're hearing it.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Speaking of conversations that parents have to have with their kids, we hear more and more about the escalation of traffic pullovers and the fact that families of color are having conversations with their kids about how to behave during traffic pullovers to prevent escalation. But we see more and more escalations as well. I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened with Tyree Nichols and that young man in Memphis, Tennessee, who was pulled over and lost his life 3 days after that pullover, after he was beaten by 5 police officers. What is happening with police escalation of traffic stops, and how is that impacting you in running a police department, and how is that impacting pullovers?
So to speak about the incident down in Memphis, I was just disgusted. I was disgusted as everybody else. I was more disgusted that I watched 5 men dressed like me, my skin color, because obviously race comes into play, whether you want it to or not. I was beyond disgusted. And those were 5 murderers. Let's call it what it is.
Absolutely.
But do we want to stop people from, not supporting the police or discourage people from being police officers? We don't want to do that as well. But we need to call out what we saw, and that's what that was. As far as it definitely takes a toll. A lot of officers, they don't necessarily want to stop people. Everybody should have a conversation with their children how to act. But yeah, unfortunately, that is a fact of life. I had to do a conversation after that incident in Memphis, and a lot of parents discussed that with me, and I get their concerns, absolutely. And I have to make sure that my officers are aware. Even though you have all the good intentions in the world, someone's perception may be just that, where you're just simply walking up to a car and they're absolutely horrified. Mm-hmm. You got to take a moment and explain things to people when you stop them.
Absolutely.
But de-escalation goes both ways. It's a two-way street. So whether you're white, green, black, or purple, there's a way to conduct yourself, and that's both sides. People need to just treat people with respect and dignity.
I know that the police chief in Memphis said that she had never witnessed anything like this in her 36 years of law enforcement. And it was it was disgraceful. But body cams and the fact that it was all captured on video is what gave it the attention that it deserved, so that those people could be brought to justice. But body cams aren't something we've been able to get in Framingham yet, right?
So I've actually have done a proposal. The mayor has it. In that proposal is a pilot for body cams. There's been a lot of research in it. So it looks like it's going to go forward, possibly in the near future. So it's not something that we're shying away from or something we would never do. There was obviously talks about it. They weren't, in the public, although I have commented on this numerous times. And yeah, this is definitely something we're working on in body cam. In the body cam footage for that incident, those officers, quite frankly, did not care that they were wearing body cams. So you can't just say—
I find that so hard to believe that they did what they did knowing.
So it tells you there's a deeper problem,
because
they were not really worried about what those cameras showed.
Right.
And that's one of the things when I've been asked about the body cams. You don't just get body cams, throw them on, and that's the end of it. You want to make sure you have the best equipment, the best available, software. You want to have training. Like I just talked about the incident at the school. We're going to take that footage and learn from it. You also want to take the footage from these body cams, whether it was something horrific, something bad. It may be for the officer's well-being. You may capture something on video where you might need to correct something with an officer so you can save their life. This isn't just about catching officers doing wrong. A lot of officers welcome these cameras.
A lot of officers are proud of the work they do.
Absolutely.
And feel fine about it. But some of the talk about resistance to the body cams has come from maybe unions that have been opposed to it. Is that an issue here?
No. Well, we haven't gotten to the negotiations yet with the union, but we definitely will. But I don't see that being an issue. When you say the blowback from the unions, it goes back to when I got on the job in the 90s. That was like something you would hear that then, no way, no how. And now you have officers, they don't want to go out in the street without the cameras. So we say policing and police officers need to move forward. Our society also needs to move forward, because we also hear people that, well, I don't want the body camera in my house, or I don't want it in this business,
right.
Or I don't want it in the schools.
True, it goes beyond just person to person.
Yeah.
So how far along are you with that? And what do you think the timeline might be?
I think we'll see a pilot program rolled out, hopefully sometime in the near future, by the end of this year, is what I'm shooting for.
I know last time you and I spoke on the show, you had mentioned a cost of over $1 million to implement a body cam program. And that was a while ago, so the costs only go up.
And that it did.
It did.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said that, because there's been so much the chief doesn't want this. I've been talking about this for years. Yeah, and we will get there, absolutely. But yeah, the cost does go up. and you want to make sure you're doing it correctly.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is, you said that not only do you want to look at the video from horrific events, but you want to look at all the videos. You want to look for opportunities to train, to teach, to use the video in the day-to-day operations.
Absolutely.
So that takes people.
Right.
Looking at videos, analyzing them, giving feedback, using them, et cetera. There's a cost associated with that.
Absolutely. And not only do you want to do it for that, you have to do it for discovery for court. You have to do it for FOIA requests, all that stuff as well. But you definitely want to do that. And it goes back to what we just talked about at Memphis. I can only assume here, and I don't like to Monday morning quarterback, but can any of us that watch that video say that any of those officers were worried about somebody watching those cameras? I'm going to go with no.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I mean, I watched it, and I'm going to go with no. You also have to archive all the video, right, and keep it for a period of time?
Correct.
What is the length of time you have to maintain?
Each case is different. So a motor vehicle stop will get one category, a homicide gets another. Oh, you get what I'm saying? So
yeah.
All that has to be managed as well.
So we have something to look forward to in terms of some progress there, and I want to thank you because I know we did speak about that quite a while ago last time you were on the show. So thank you for making that progress and for reporting on the status of that today. Let's talk a little bit about just police impression overall. How do we change, the tension between the public and the police, the negative publicity, the things that have gone wrong that have caused friction between the communities and the police force? What's being done about that?
I think the biggest thing that's being done from what my tenure doing this 27 years is you take an incident like George Floyd, you take an incident like Memphis, police really didn't speak out about those incidents. You knew it was wrong, you knew it was bad, and you kind of just kept quiet and let what happened happen. You can't find a police chief, a police department, a patrol officer not speaking up about bad conduct. But we have to continue to do our jobs. We have to hold people accountable. We have to continue to do the work that we do. You have to stay in the community. And when things are good, when things are bad, you have to keep continuing to build the partnerships and being out and being part of the community. That's where you build the trust. There's obviously these incidents go on all over the country and they'll affect, it could be 3,000 miles away, but it's going to affect us here. But you have to do what you're capable of controlling. And that means here in Framingham, we have to make sure we're part of the community, building partnerships, and just treating people the way they want to be treated and treating people how we would want to be treated.
So when you hear terms like defund the police or reform the police, or they give different impressions. They don't really mean what they're intended to mean. What message would you want to convey?
I think that's the most ridiculous thing ever. Defund the police. So in one breath, the same people that are saying defund the police usually say the police need better training. Well, I agree. Give us all the training we can. You don't get good training by defunding. Mm-hmm. We here in Framingham, we do a lot of work with social agencies. We try to defer people to social agencies. We try to defer arrests if somebody could do better in some type of mental health treatment or something like that. But you call any of those numbers after 5 and they'll tell you to hang up and call 911 because they're closed. So why not train the people that are going to answer the calls when all the other resources that you want the police matters to go to, we have to now be able to handle those as well. Mm-hmm. And we take that on. It is tough. We'll take it on and we'll continue to do it, but you got to fund it.
Now, you have also been given quite a few accolades for the jail diversion program in Framingham, and you were asked to travel abroad in order to share some of the successes with that program. Maybe you can tell us how that's going.
Well, first, I don't like to take the accolades personally. I definitely want to thank the men and women that do the work every day and the clinicians as well. But a huge thank you needs to go to Deputy Chief Craig Davis at the time. He started this program 20 years ago. When you asked me to tell my younger self, what would you be thinking about when I thought, this is crazy, why are we doing this? And he was way ahead of his time. And it's just an amazing program, and yeah, we've traveled internationally.
And for people who don't know what it is, just a quick summary.
So what it is the Framingham Police Department for 20 years has had embedded clinicians within our police department, and these clinicians ride along with us right in the cruises. They go to calls. If someone's suffering from a mental health crisis, they're right there on scene. We use them to de-escalate situations. We use them to divert from arrests, divert from the ER. And they've taken on a much bigger role. They also do follow-up for overdoses for us. They do counseling and follow-ups when we have to get people mandated treatment for alcohol abuse. They do homeless outreach for us. Anything you can ask of these men and women do. If we're on a death notification, you know, they're on scene with us. If we're at a horrific incident and maybe there's some children involved and somebody's got to be with the children, they stay and they do that. They are part of our in-house. When we talk about these debrief with the officers, they take part in that as well. They're completely embedded, completely part of the police department.
That is an amazing collaboration.
Yeah.
How widespread is it becoming now, and how widespread do you think it should be?
Well, it's definitely growing, especially here in the Commonwealth. It's, you know, we've gone to Ireland. It's growing internationally. It is growing so much that it's actually hard to find clinicians when you need to hire one, because a lot of police departments are hiring them now.
And they are putting themselves in situations that they may not have been prepared for either, but hopefully you're preparing them.
Yes, so we do. They sign on. This isn't a follow-up program. They're in the thick of it.
Yeah. And so it's almost as if they're some kind of police officer themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they know their role.
Unintended, but
yeah, but they find themselves in the middle of it, and that's what they're there for. And they truly embrace it, and they're unbelievable men and women that do this job.
Well, and obviously they take direction from you, and there's been some great progress made in the force, and the community has you to thank for that. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Special thanks to Chief Baker, a return guest who puts in the extra effort to keep us informed about issues affecting the safety of our community. We'll be back with Framingham Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Robert Tremblay, after this break, so stay with us.
Mom, I got it. What are you doing in there?
I got stuck.
Are you a dog?
I wouldn't do that. Have you seen the pliers? Where'd you find those?
It's not your birthday.
Sorry.
Bye, Grandpa.
Bye, Grandpa.
Take care of yourself.
What are you doing? What are you looking for?
Joining me now is Dr. Robert Tremblay, Superintendent of the Framingham Schools, to talk about the active shooter alarm that went off at Framingham High School on the Friday before the February winter break. It was an event that has had a tremendous impact in so many ways, and the learning from that unfortunate experience continues. We'll also be talking about other timely education issues. So thanks so much for taking the time to be here today, Dr. Tremblay. I'm sure you're probably getting a little tired of having to go over this and over this and over this, but we're here again today to get more information out to parents and the public.
Sure, I always appreciate being on your show, and honestly, I appreciate those spaces where we can just tell the truth, tell the story, and help with understanding. And,
yeah, you always say that you want to make sure people get all the information, and you like this forum so that you can just give it to them straight and not have to go through any filters. So I share that with you, and I'm so glad that you were able to come. How would you rate the response, or better yet, when was that active shooter system actually installed at Framingham High School?
Yeah, so just a little bit of context about what it is. So
Yeah.
it's called the Eagle is the name brand. And
Eagle?
It's Eagle, E-A-G-L. And it's what's called it's a gunshot detection system. And
Is that an acronym? Does it stand for anything?
not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
It's just their branding name. Imagine these sensors being like your smoke alarms in your house. But what they do is, if you had an intruder in the building and there were shots fired, this system would detect the gunshot sound. It would actually also detect the specific kind of gun that it was fired from. And ideally what it does is it communicates over the PA system to tell everybody in the building that there's an active shooter and where the shooter is, and so by location. And that allows people to be responsive, right? Because if the bad guy's outside your door, you're going to lock yourself in place. You're going to be prepared to counter that person if you have to. Or if you're a mile away, or the other side of the high school, which feels like a mile away, you're going to evacuate and get out of that space.
Right.
So unlike those days that we learned from Columbine, where everyone huddles into the table, there's not a need to do that, right? So the approach is different. And so that system really helps to facilitate that, to know where you are and when and how to keep yourself as safe as possible.
And to be able to know what type of gun it is. I mean, it sounds like a pretty advanced system.
It is.
When did you have it installed?
So 2019, just before the pandemic, that school year, in fact, we had Governor Baker and many of the folks came out from it was a grant, it was a safety and security grant that Framingham was awarded for just under $60,000. And so it was grant funds. We installed the system. I know there's been some question about how many schools. It was installed just at Framingham High School. We had hosted the governor in the event at Walsh Middle School. And we installed the system shortly thereafter and really didn't have the system activated, although we were planning to have that rollout in addition to this ALICE training. The pandemic hit and it put a pause on all of those system rollout for us. We focused all of our attention on educating in a pandemic.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of answers the next question, which is why would you even have it that long without it ever being active? You were waiting for what?
Well, so the initial rollout, again, pre-pandemic was we would have the system installed. We were starting to do our ALICE training, which is an acronym. That is an acronym for Alert, Lockdown, Inform, Counter, and Evacuate, ALICE. And basically those are the tools in the toolbox when, if and when this happens. And we're prepared very well for fire drills. We do that all the time, multiple times a year, but yet there's not school fires in like 100+ years. Yet there's active shooter situations across the country every day.
True.
And how prepared are we for that? So
Yeah.
this was part and parcel to a larger plan. The ALICE training for staff rolled out later to ALICE training for students, and then plugged into this active shooter detection system so people know how to behave in the event of an emergency. So that was the intended rollout. That was all put on pause as we had to figure out how to teach and learn in a pandemic. Post-pandemic, we're back. We're finishing all of our staff training with ALICE, and next is the student rollout.
Now, in conversations around the city, you hear people say, oh, the administration didn't even know it was there. They didn't even know that it was installed. They didn't even know that it could go off. Is any of that real? Is that true?
Well, so the system was installed in 1920. I would say probably it was in the later half of the
2020?
year.
Yeah.
2019
or 2020?
It was that 1920 school year.
Oh, the 1920
So I think it
school
was
year.
actually
Okay.
installed. The grant was in 19, but the installation was probably in 2020.
Yeah.
Then the pandemic happened. So I think there was probably some level of people who had forgotten it was installed. It was put in there, sort of out of sight, out of mind. Everyone really was distracted, understandably, with COVID. So there may be administrators who were aware that this was installed, and others who may be new to the role who weren't even aware of it. Certainly the staff and students were not aware. We'd never really introduced the system formally to the district.
Yeah, that certainly accentuates the intensity of hearing it and not even knowing it could possibly go off, not even knowing it existed.
Right, and that did startle everybody, all the way up to the central office, that we
Right.
had heard the system. That
Were
no
you
one had
there
heard
then
of.
when that happened?
I was in my office.
You
when
were in
that
your
happened.
office. So
Yeah.
you heard it when it went off?
No, so it was only
Oh, your
communicated
office
within
is
the
in
building.
the high school, right?
Yeah, it's separate from that. And actually, when the alarm had gone off, nobody had been familiar with the enunciation of that alarm. And so I was like, what is this? We haven't heard this before. We don't know that voice. We don't know
Who
this
is it?
warning.
Where's it coming from?
In fact, the principal herself thought it was that she initially thought one of the students had gotten on the intercom and was sort of playing around.
Oh, maybe a hoax.
Yeah, because at the same time, we were dealing with those hoaxes across the country.
Right.
Coming in about these threats. So the timing of it was really unfortunate. Right? You had the national hoaxing that was happening called the swatting, and then on top of that, you have this alarm that goes off. And we had just communicated to the community about these swatting calls, and that the police are very much in tune with that. And then a day later, this
Had
alarm.
any swatting calls happened in Framingham?
No, knock wood.
Because can you explain how those work?
Yeah, they're like automated calls that would call usually the police department 911, and it would be some sort of a school threat. But any of those, you have to take those seriously. So it takes time and resources to look into that. And so we wanted to let the community know that this has been happening in other communities in the state and around the country, and that we were not aware of this being a threat to Framingham, but we would keep our eye on it. And then lo and behold, like the next day, the alarm goes off. So people are thinking, oh, it must be related to the swatting hoax, which it had nothing to do with that, actually.
So most people didn't know it was there, but somebody knew it was there. Look, why would a custodian change a battery why would they do that if it's not active?
Yeah, so we're not going to name names on your show, but I will tell you, so it wasn't a custodian, but it was a staff member, a couple of staff members in the district, really well-meaning. Just to be clear with everybody, nobody did anything with any malintent here, right? Everyone was trying to do the right thing. The chronology of this was, as I mentioned, about the system being installed and rolled out as part of the ALICE training. Over the February break, in fact, the Wednesday of that week, the intention was to have the system, Eagle detection system, work in partnership with our safety and security team and the Framingham Police Department and make sure the system did what it was supposed to be doing. We're ready to roll it out. The detection system advised the school department, say, hey, in anticipation of our visit on Wednesday, there's 2 sensors we want to make sure that we're keeping our eye on remotely, because they're watching the system, which many of us didn't even know was active.
It's like a central office, like for an alarm company, but only for this type of a device.
That's exactly right.
And
Not
so
even
they
based in Massachusetts, based I think out of New Mexico.
So they were like, okay, we're going to do this next week, so in anticipation, you should make sure your battery is working.
That's it. And so really, when you take apart all the pieces, it's really a very innocent, well-meaning story.
Sure.
In context of the trauma that this the impact of it.
And we live in a world where everybody wants to blame somebody.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure you've been bombarded with people who are like trying to say to you, okay, I want to know who did it. You've probably had to deal with that ever since
Yeah, I mean,
it
that
happened.
happens, right? And in a social media world, they want answers now, they demand answers now, we should know about that. And I get that. Everyone wants to sort of know what happened.
And I'm sure the person feels bad enough as it is.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that was one of the first steps to take, was to make sure that these individuals were okay. Because as much as they created an impact for others who are still recovering and it may take time, they too had that same impact on something. So the system that was believed to be sort of inactive. And there was some back and forth about whether or not batteries could be changed. Now, why the employees chose to change the batteries? Well, school was in session when it could have been done on the next day, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. That's a discussion, right? Hindsight's 20/20.
That doesn't warrant any kind of disciplinary action, or does it?
No, I mean, from my view of that, and I can't really speak to the personnel matter side of that, but to be sure, there's conversations that have been had and follow-up that needs to happen on that, right? It's just not a good practice. And in fact, the school committee, even since then, we've put a policy. It's been our matter of practice to not change alarms or address systems that are, life emergency systems during the day, for the very reason that it could be a trip.
Right.
We don't want that to happen. Again, it was well-meaning. Let's change the battery, get this done in anticipation of the Wednesday training. Well-intended.
Yeah.
The first of the 2 sensors was changed without a problem. It was the second sensor that was problematic, causing the alarm to sound, causing everything that we are still now trying to pick up the pieces from.
So Police Chief Baker came to discuss this as well, and he said that there were 2 detectives in the high school at that time working on an unrelated matter who happened to call it in to the Framingham Police Department. How would they normally have gotten that notice if those detectives weren't in the school at that time?
So when the system would be brought online, it would have an automatic notification system to
Oh, so that's not even in place yet?
No, because remember, the whole system was installed, it was paused. And so this, for most people, was like, oh yeah, we know that, or it might be there. No one was really thinking about it until it went off. So it would be on an automatic notification to police. So it happened that 2 detectives were there who then called it in, and the Framingham police were amazing in their response. You see a lot of national criticism around school shootings where police officers go the other way. And I'll tell you, all the
Chief
Framingham
Baker said that
officers-
will never happen in Framingham. He
and
said
he's right.
he has a very strict protocol about the expectations, and he said that he makes it very clear when officers are hired what that protocol is, and that nobody stands around. Everybody goes for the safety of the students.
And in a drill, you might see that, but this is, for many, this was reality.
Of course, yeah.
It was a school shooter without a shooter.
Exactly.
And so how people behaved that day is really how they would behave in a real life scenario, not in a typical drill fashion, and the police were amazing.
So thinking about that, how would you rate the response by students, teachers, and now that you've had a chance to really see it, are you looking to learn from it and change it in any way, keep everything exactly the same? Is it an experience that helps somewhere down the road if, unfortunately, this type of thing ever happens?
Yeah, active shooter drills are generally unpopular for the very reason that we lived, right?
Yeah.
The trauma that could be induced unnecessarily in preparing for it, but at the same time, one could argue that you need to be prepared for this, just like we would for a fire. We haven't normalized this kind of, and for a lot of reasons, right? People don't want to believe it'll happen in their backyard, number one, but number two is they can't fathom the idea of loss of life in a way like this. So I think there's a balance. There's a lot of lessons learned that came from this. What we learned was the police were immediately responsive and they came into the situation, and that the staff, by the police reporting of this, did exactly what they should have done. They evacuated when the distance was where it should be, and they sort of bunkered down and sheltered in place and barricaded where the shooter was believed to be. So by all accounts, everyone behaved right. The only downside to this, right, was that nobody was really prepared to know what that alarm sounds like and to know. So they had heard it for the first time, and that's not how you would drill. You would never do it that way. So we have to think now, well, everyone has heard it at the high school, or most everyone has, but we've discovered our PA system needs to be improved. We've discovered our internal communications need to be improved, because many of our community were finding out about this on social media before they were finding out from the school department. And there's explanations for all of that.
Good, because I wanted to ask you about that, because there was public comment about the media being informed significantly sooner than parents and teachers and students about what had happened.
Yeah, and you know what happens? This is not an uncommon part of the job on any topic, right? There's always the assertion first instead of the question first, right? So you must have, whatever the claim is, Tremblay must have picked up the phone and called the media in a sensationalizing story, as opposed to letting us know first, us being whomever, right?
Parents, teachers.
Parents, whatever,
yeah.
whoever that us
Students.
is. When you are in that moment, though, and the media calls you and says, we believe there's an active shooter at the high school, is that true? And I had just found out at that point that it was a false alarm of the system. To me, that was a very different scenario than me communicating that I'm going to be on the Audrey Hall show in a public media. This is about let everybody know, use every communication forum we have, tell everybody everywhere this is a false alarm. It doesn't matter in what order. We need to make sure that families know that their children are safe. So, however social media, however that played out, because the alternative would be what? I get a phone call and I say, I'm not prepared to comment on that yet, if I know it's a false alarm. That seems to be more problematic to me than the order and sequence of events. But people don't necessarily want to hear that, right? But what should have happened, though, in truth, is the communication, when it was known to be false at the high school, it should have been immediately communicated out to students and to staff and to families through text messaging. That was a miss, and we've since uncovered why and how to fix that going forward. But that would have been the way. Not so much an email, not so much a phone call, but most people are looking at their phone for a text. And certainly, even if not everyone sees it, the vast majority might and say, okay, I can stop running now, or I can stop barricading now. It doesn't change the trauma, it doesn't change the hurt, but the timing of that, to find out from some other media source 20 minutes after the event is over, that's not okay. That's never okay. But just to give some context as to how and why those kinds of things happen, but we since have found some ways to improve that communication internally going forward. And a lot of it comes down to who when the high school is busy in the moment, who should communicate that.
Right.
And then to the people who can communicate, have access to those communications. And we found out the answer was no. The answer today is now yes.
So you've learned,
learned.
And you've been able to evaluate changes that need to be made. What about the alarm system? People keep referring to it as active shooter in the singular. So the question that kept coming to my mind is, what if there's more than one person, or what if someone's inside and outside, and everybody's rushing outside? It seems to me that that in itself raises some questions. So what are there other protocols that you're going to put in place? I mean, every situation could be different.
Yeah, that's a great, I hadn't heard that before, that specific question. That's new in this process to me, because the system is designed to presumably do to track a singular event or maybe events inside the school.
Right.
But like you say, what if the event were outside? That came up too as well when students are all evacuating. Well, shouldn't you have a reunification? What about getting everybody back together again? Because that proved to be problematic as well. So unlike a fire drill or a gas leak where you'd have a reunification, in a case like a school shooter, you want to scatter. You want to not be in any kind of congregation. But it does present some challenges, right? If people are all over Framingham when the families are trying to be reunited together, and presumably that was able to happen through a cell phone. But what if you didn't have a cell phone? And that was also problematic. And the school committee also moved the policy forward on that, was Wi-Fi access in the basement level of the high school where it's difficult to get a cell signal. So we're addressing that as well. So again, another lesson learned on this one. But you raise a really good point about, and we don't want to disclose too much about our safety security
Right.
plans. Because the bad guy could be watching the show.
Exactly.
Could be watching your program and say, I want to know what we're going to do now.
Exactly.
So I'm not going to tell you everything
Right.
for that reason.
Good.
Right?
You want to keep people safe, right? Safety
Exactly.
is the goal.
That is my number one job in this district.
It's even a shame that we have to be talking about this,
is.
that we live in a world right now where this is something we have to discuss. But it's a reality, and so you have to prepare. You mentioned a couple of times already that there have been some new policies put in place. Let's talk about those.
Sure.
Those are learning experiences and changes that have been made in response. What are they?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of, and there's several of them, as you mentioned. One around getting the Wi-Fi and making sure that there's signal for cell service, whether that's through Wi-Fi or through improved cellular communications, but not just at the high school, but at all schools, right? So we can apply the best practices across the entire district. That's an example of one. I mentioned earlier about just as a general practice. It's not if the fire alarm panel was in trouble, we would probably wait until the end of the school day or until a weekend, and we would have that. I say probably, we do. It was a matter of practice, but we don't have a policy that spells out that we don't do these things. We don't change batteries on life systems like this during the school day. So that's something that will be fairly easy to roll out, and I don't even think that'll take 2 readings for us to adopt that. So there are a number of other ways that things have come up about policy around not paying the vendor until we know. There's a variety of levels of policy, and so we've suspended that. There have been no payments to that particular vendor, but we want to make sure we don't put anything forward until we now bring them back out to review and do a system analysis. So we've created a tracking sheet, a tracker. I'm happy to make this public to you as well. I've shared it with the entire high school so that the high school community is aware of what we're paying attention to, from the PA system to cellular improvements to policy adoption, that tracks what's been said, what's the status of that, who's paying attention to it, when will it be done? Because most people want to know, okay, it happened, we move forward, now what?
Right.
And when will it be done?
Right.
And so we want to put that forward to everybody to see, including the ALICE training
Good.
and all those pieces.
I can't tell you how frustrating it is. So many places I go where I don't understand a word they're saying on the PA system. It's all jarbled, and I'm thinking, well, I know I'm supposed to hear what they're saying, sometimes even on a plane or on a train or something like that. So hopefully it's clear in your system and that people can understand what's being said.
I'm not confident the PA is going to be, that is a capital longer term fix, and I think that will be helpful. I think where people live is with their phones. Mm-hmm. And if I'm getting a text that tells me so I can read it and see it right in my hand, then I'm not going to miss what that communication is. And
True. It's much more direct.
That's right. And if I'm getting it in my own language.
You can't really misinterpret it if it's written properly. Let's just talk about the aftermath in terms of recovery from this. Obviously, it creates a level of post-traumatic stress, and that's probably being experienced by anyone from the person who changed the battery to the students, to the parents, to the teachers, administrators, yourself. I mean, what are you doing about that? How much do you need to do, and how serious is it?
Yeah, the first effort was to put forward counseling support, local talent, our own staff, but also outside partners who have the training. Courtney Blanco, who's our Director of Health and Wellness, her background is in crisis counseling. She did that for the American Red Cross. So we had, it was when we had the previous director, Judy Steyer. She seemed to be with us during COVID, and her background is in nursing. And we have a crisis counselor who happens to be with us, and we have just the right people at the right time, fortuitously. So that was the first order of business, and we had counselors available immediately that Saturday, the next day, and then through vacation week, and then even upon return to school with an extension to keep those.
It
in
creates a
place.
fear factor about going to school. People,
It does.
Once something like that happens, whether it's real or not, it becomes real, and it, it's a reality check.
It is. Many students left, like you'd leave in a moment of crisis. You left everything where it was. I mean, there was things everywhere. So about 100 or so staff and students in total over the break came into the school to either take advantage of counseling support, and then others would just go and with their families. I was sitting in the lobby, and I would talk to families and be available to them as the counseling staff would be. Maybe just to walk back to the classroom, or just to do that before the return, just to have some level of comfort coming back. And I would say that even to this day, weeks later, it's still hard for many staff and students to come back in every day knowing that it was triggering.
Will you still be offering
We will.
those services?
Yeah, and the school committee put that as one of the other policy matters forward as well, to continue sustained offerings for counseling support, and which we of course will do. On the first day back for students, we had a delayed start for students to center our staff, make sure that our staff are okay, but also to talk about how they would facilitate that first moments back when the students returned, to give them scripts for conversations. And for some students, they were like, hey, can we just move on with learning already? They were far enough away, they maybe didn't hear the announcement. Their level of impact was very different than the staff and students in J Hall, where the alarm was signaled, that were really barricading for their life and prepared to counter.
Right.
It's a different level of impact for some of those students and for our staff. So we're sensitive to that, but we had 27 counseling support staff on the first day back, and just available to staff and students. So the mental health was the priority and continues to be for us.
And mental health has been a priority even as we're, dare I say, that at the tail end, but still in the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
So you've been dealing with students and others with issues of social isolation, the impact that all of that has had on education. You've been using those resources and services for that. Now this. How is all of that combined creating an environment that's conducive to learning?
It's, I think if I was a senior in high school this year, you'd think back to, when you think back of your memories of being in school, there's not a lot of great memories. There's a lot of memories that are made with friends, but in terms of the world, right? You lived through a pandemic, and through a potential active shooter, which you believe to be real. Why wouldn't you? There's a lot of trauma that is being packed with our kids, and that's unfortunate, and it's really too bad. We're trying to provide those resources, so I hope that we're in a better space where people are more comfortable coming forward to say, I recognize that I need help, because we can line up those resources, so you're not having to wait 3 months for a counselor. We can make that happen more quickly.
And the impact on learning too. How is that playing out?
It's we just had a discussion on this with the leadership team as we look forward in our strategic planning, because that is an important question, is that we have to meet students where they're at. But what if our students are 3 years behind grade level? We can't have them graduate, with the content knowledge of a freshman. And so we need to meet them where they're at, but at grade level expectations. So we have to catch them up, and that has been the name of the game. And a part of it is getting students to show up to school. Chronic absenteeism is a problem, not only here, but everywhere across the country, about students who are reluctant to come back to school since the pandemic. Now couple that, or layer onto that, this particular situation, which for the reluctant student makes it even more impossible. And so that's what we're paying attention to right now. We have a lot of work to do. We have to remind ourselves we are a teaching and learning organization. That's our primary function. But teaching and learning can't happen until students know they're in a place where they can feel safe, sense of belonging, valued, loved. That all comes with it, right? Fed, they have clothes. So all those social responsibilities. I've heard someone mentioned the schools are doing a good job with social services, but need to do more with academics. But really, it's all part of the hierarchy of need, and we have to fulfill the basics before we can get to those next steps, which we'll get to. So it's a big lift, and it's a big lift before the pandemic.
It's a very big lift, and it's been compounded.
It has.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, for the people who think we're going to see a turnaround and make this all better, tomorrow, It's going to be years before we see the real fruits of the labor that we did before the pandemic, and even longer, especially as we try to address some of the mental health crises, which are very, very real. But I applaud our kids and our staff for being aware of that and seeking out the help. To have even 100 that said, I need support.
Absolutely.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And maybe that is a step of removing the stigma.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It certainly helps understand some of the challenges that everyone's being confronted with and how they're being addressed. So it's very helpful for people to understand what's going on behind the scenes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Special thanks again to Dr. Robert Tremblay, Superintendent of the Framingham Schools, and Chief Lester Baker of the Framingham Police Department for taking the time to be here to talk about issues of safety and education in Framingham. And thank you for tuning into the Audrey Hall Show, where you will always learn something new.